And we are ready.
I'm not hearing anything.
Nellie, we're ready. Go. This is Behind the News with Nellie Bailey.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Behind the News, right here on our own radio station here in Central Harlem, the heart of Harlem, Grant House's Community Radio. Before we begin our program, we wish to state that the views expressed in this program are that solely of the producer and her guest. And our guest for today is none other than my friend and a housing expert of many decades, John Fisher, who is the founder of Tenant.net. It is a stable of information for tenants all over the city, and indeed, to a certain extent, all over the state in terms of information, laws, court decisions, you name it, it's all there. John is a longtime activist. He is about to embark on his own radio program on WBAI, where he will have a half hour, 30-minute broadcast. Okay, John Fisher, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Nellie. And I just wanted to say that the thing with BAI is it's under discussion. There's no definite decision whether I'll be doing a show or not.
Oh, okay. Well, I stand correctly. Well, the point is that someone at BAI and obviously someone in management felt that you were a vital and valuable voice on tenant issues in New York City and New York State. So,
well, I won't argue with that.
Okay, so that won't the fact that nothing is yet confirmed cannot distract from the fact that you were asked to host a program. But anyway, we are talking about this program and my program, Behind the News. And first, John, let's start with your critique of the housing crisis. We can either start nationally and work ourselves down to the state and the city, or vice versa, wherever you wish to start.
Well,
just a general overview of the housing crisis that has beset the U.S. since the pandemic that really started in terms of the government reaction in March of this year.
Well, I was going to ask. I assume you meant from the effects of the pandemic, not the housing crisis that we've been under for the last 100 years.
No, the pandemic itself. But if you wish to elaborate on this ongoing historical housing crisis that we've had, regardless of the pandemic, please do so and work yourself up to the pandemic.
Well, there's been for at least a century, if not more. I'd say since the mid 1800s, actually, there's been I don't know if pressure is the right word, but there's been a crisis might be a little bit too much, but there's definitely been a situation where people have difficulty in finding affordable housing. Now, rather than go through a whole history of this, which would take many hours, suffice to say that a lot of the politics around surround themselves on the claim that affordable housing. And what does that mean? it doesn't mean all that much. It just means something that somebody can afford in plain English. But a lot of people take that to the nth degree, and they use it in very much of a political manner.
Grant houses, community radio, the soul of the Upper West Side.
Hello? You
Yes,
still there?
please continue.
Okay, I just heard sounded like a station.
No,
turn
no,
on.
please continue. Let's.
Okay. Anyway, in any case, over the last century or so, we've had rent control and rent stabilization, and that's branched out into public housing and other types of housing. Um, all sorts of different types of programs, and many of which is what I'm trying to say is a lot of it's political, and the elected officials kind of use that in a way to bolster themselves rather than actually solve the problems on this. And, for example, and I know we're not talking about it, but we get into the whole issue of 80/20, where they claim that they're providing affordable housing, and they're really not. But in any case, let me segue quickly over to the pandemic. And at this point, I'm sure everybody knows what the pandemic's all about. I don't need to go into that whole thing. If you don't know, you haven't been awake for the last 6 months or so. But what that's done is it's left many tenants in a situation, if they've lost their job, they simply cannot pay rent. It's not a question of them wanting to. It's not a question of a voluntary strike on their part. It's a situation they just don't have the money. And in normal times, the landlords would seek to have them evicted. They would go to court and they would try to get the tenants evicted. Some of the tenants might have good defenses, if the landlord's not providing services or something like that. But what's happened is because the courts have also shut down, and because there's various moratoriums in effect at the moment, there's a backlog. And it depends on who you talk to, but the number that I've heard, and it seems legitimate, is that there are up to 200,000.
Yes, that's the number that I've
Cases
read
where
about.
and this number keeps building, by the way, because as time goes on and people can't pay their rent, and the landlords might get frustrated. It becomes a situation where the minute they open the courts, there's going to be a race to try to evict people, and they've come up with all sorts of different solutions, which are really not solutions at all, where they may hold off on the actual evictions, but the tenants still owe the money. And if they've lost their job, either temporarily or permanently, they may not eventually have the money. So, I mean, for example, the latest version of one of these moratoriums came actually from the federal government this week. Came from the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, and that was under the idea behind it is that people who are no longer able to stay in their apartments, they may be at risk of exposure of the virus if they're on the street. So what they did was, under their police powers, they said that there's going to be a moratorium. Now, this may or may not have come down through President Trump. I don't know, but it did come down, and it affects pretty much on a national basis tenants all over the country. However, it's limited in what it can do. It only affects people within a certain income range. It only covers people that are dealing with a case involving non-payment, not through a holdover situation where, for example, if your landlord is taking you to court claiming you violated your lease because you're playing loud music at 3 o'clock in the morning or something like that. Those kind of cases are not covered by this. But what the thing is, and this has been the main complaint over all of these different versions, both state and federal, is that it doesn't cover the rent. It doesn't excuse the rent. So later on, the tenants will still be liable for the rent. And let's say this COVID goes until say January or February, or we have no idea how long it's going to last. And eventually they're going to owe rent for the last 6 months or the last 8 months, however long it's been since they've been unable to pay their rent. So this is really no permanent and real solution. It's a band-aid. And that might be fine for some people. They can't make the rent in September of this year, and that covers it. It keeps them inside. It keeps them from being evicted. That much is good. Now, just as you and I both know, there's also a state law that does kind of the same thing. The problem with the state and local laws is there's so many of them, and it's gotten to a situation where there's almost one new law being introduced daily on this kind of thing, and they all do different things, and they're all introduced by different people, and they all have different levels of support. Now, no law, even if the law is sitting in committee up in Albany, unless it gets passed by both houses of the legislature, unless it gets signed by the governor, it goes nowhere. So there's a lot of these laws that are just sitting there doing absolutely nothing, yet they get press coverage. And now combine that with the various moratoriums put in place by the governor, by the mayor, by the courts themselves, and there's extreme confusion as to what's going on. I'm part of a listserv with a number of tenant lawyers, and they get confused over a lot of this. They don't really know what's going on because these memos that are being issued on a daily basis by the court administration, they don't really explain, or they contradict each other, or they overlap, and so nobody really knows. Sometimes even the landlord lawyers put out a statement saying this is how we see it, and it may not necessarily be how a tenant lawyer would see it, but at least there's some kind of analysis of what's required in order for a certain law to take effect. For example, there's this law called the Safe Harbor law that was introduced by State Senator Brad Hoylman, who covers my area. He's my state senator down in the Hellston Clinton area, Manhattan.
Excuse me, but the Safe Harbor Act is applicable to all tenants, correct?
I'm here, yes.
Yes, I just wanted to add
Hello?
that. Yes, I wanted to add the clarity that the Safe Harbor Act applies to all tenants and not just in a politician's district. I just wanted to make that clear.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's a statewide law. And it does apply to everybody, but it also is limited based on a number of things. And I don't want to get into all the details because in many people's eyes, this law is just a giveaway to landlords. It doesn't cancel the rent.
Can you deal with
stop an eviction on it.
Can you deal with the specifics of the Safe Harbor Act being a giveaway to landlords and doing very little for tenants? Can you talk about that in terms of specifics?
I was just starting to do that. Yes. What it does is it, on a short-term basis, it prevents an eviction anytime between now and whenever the emergency is lifted. We don't know when that's going to be, so it's kind of open-ended at this point. But it only deals with tenants who are being taken to court for non-payment of rent. It does not deal with holdover situations, just as I mentioned with the Trump law. And so if the landlord is thinking that you're doing something wrong, again, it could be anything. It could be playing music in the middle of the night. It could be drug dealing. It could be anything that they say that you're violating the lease or creating a nuisance. Then that law does not apply to a tenant who's accused of that. What it does is a short-term law that prevents an actual eviction. It stops the marshal from coming to your door and knocking on your door and hauling all of your possessions out to the street. That is what is stopped. You are still liable for the rent at some point in the future. and the landlord down the road, maybe next spring or whenever this is all lifted, they may bring another lawsuit against you and saying that we want possession of the apartment in addition to a money judgment. So what this does is it creates a money judgment that may affect your credit. And this is important to a lot of people. Your credit rating is your ability to, get a credit card or otherwise. And this is something, if there's a money judgment against you, that's going to impact that seriously. So this law is, again, it's a Band-Aid. And this is the law that was signed by Governor Cuomo. There are other laws that are pending that are sitting in committee doing nothing that might do various things. For example, there's the Emergency Housing Stabilization and Displacement Prevention Act, and that was introduced by Senator Delnor Myrie, who I believe is in Brooklyn. To be honest, I don't know what that law does. There was another one called the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act, which was introduced by Senator Salazar, also out in Brooklyn. That cancels the rent and the mortgages. But the thing is, canceling the rent, and this is something that's being pushed by a number of housing groups throughout the city, that is something that it's a double-edged sword. And they're spending a lot of political capital on just this goal, and it may be something that may, in the end, hurt tenants. Again, it's a situation of what's a Band-Aid versus a long-term solution. Now, as much as I do not want to feel sorry for any landlords, even some good landlords. It's not like I'm trying to say that the landlord is hurting and all of that. But they are, especially the smaller ones. When you look at a building, somebody's got to pay the bills to operate a building, and that includes the electricity, the gas and oil, the heating, the hot water. All you have to pay the superintendent who provides maintenance. If a person owns a building, they may have a mortgage that they have to pay on. So all of these things are things that go into the operation of the building. And again, I don't feel sorry for a lot of landlords because they've been screwing the tenants for so many years. But still, there are a few honest landlords out there. They've got to pay mortgage to the banks that have allowed them to own the building. So if they're not getting rent, then somewhere up the food chain, somebody's going to have to swallow all of this. So if the tenants aren't paying the rent, the landlords can't pay the bank, and so on. So they're kind of caught in the middle on this as well. And so some people are looking for a solution that covers both. And some of these laws that have been introduced try to do that. There's a bill called it's called the Housing Access and Voucher Law. I think that's what it's called. I was going through, I must have 200 emails with different articles talking about these things. I've just collected them over the last 6 months. Brian Kavanaugh, who's the state senator in Brooklyn, and Assembly Member Simbrowitz, I think he runs the housing committee in the assembly. They introduced a law that would provide vouchers for tenants, but the vouchers would end up paying the landlords, so the landlords wouldn't necessarily get caught.
The money would go directly to the landlord. Could
through
you
a voucher system, yeah.
A voucher system? Could you also talk about Governor Cuomo's tenant emergency relief program that is now over? It started in July and it ended in August, that granted some funds to tenants if they could prove supposedly a rental hardship because of the virus.
Well, to be honest, I don't know a lot of details about it, because once I saw what they were up to, and a lot of people understood that this it was something that was very limited to very few tenants. There was an application period. I think it was like all of 2 weeks where people could apply for it, and it depended on whether or not you've tried to if you've lost income due to the virus, um, and many people have, then you would kind of qualify for this, and that would provide some relief. But it was very limited. And what they were going to do, DHCR, our wonderful state agency that can't help but screw tenants one way or the other, they took these applications and they're sorting them out. What they say is based on need, not based on who applied first or anything like that. But it's however they define need, and nobody knows what their criteria is. And then the tenants would get some relief. But again, this is very limited. This is Governor Cuomo's way of saying that he's watching it, he's trying to deal with it, he's handling the situation, but he's really not. And a lot of these bills that we were just discussing also are just partial um, things. I don't want to say solutions because they don't solve anything. Um, in I'm sorry, hold on a second. I'm coughing myself here. And in the end, and we don't know how long this is going to last. But when the courts reopen, and we don't know when that will be, and when evictions can take place, there's going to be a lot of evictions. There's already around 200,000 cases sitting
Yes,
there,
John, if you could pause for a
waiting
moment,
to be dealt
let's
with.
talk about that 200,000 cases, eviction cases that were pending before March, before the,
Well, I'm a little I'm a little unclear on this because I've also seen the number 14,000 or 14,500, and I thought that was the number of cases that were actually pending before March the 7th, when these orders first came down, and that the 200,000 were cases that kind of have built up in the backlog. But I'm not really certain because yes, I've seen some articles that say that the 200,000 cases were pending in March as well. So I'm not sure which is which. I do know that a lot of people are using the number 200,000. That's a very believable number if you want to take the last 6 months. But whether that was in place before March or not, I honestly don't know. Because if it was 200,000 in March, then we're probably three times that now in September. Simply look on a normal year, and this is a number that I've known for many, many years. I don't know if it's changed or not, but on a normal year, I think back in the 90s or the 80s, the New York City Civil Court, which covers the housing court, they would get 300,000 cases filed per year by landlords.
would you repeat that
That's a
number
lot.
again? How many?
300,000. Now,
Uh-huh.
this is just a number that's been bandied about over the years. It may have changed. And one reason I think it might have gone down is because of this program called Right to Counsel, which helps in many ways, but that's an aside. But 300,000. So over a 6 month period, it's entirely believable that there might be 150,000 cases. Now, all that doesn't mean that 300,000 are going to be evicted on a normal year. That just means there's cases. Most cases get settled in the hallway. The tenant agrees to
Well, much
pay
to
the
the
back rent. They make
disadvantage of the
there's a
tenants.
one shot.
I said
That's
the
true. That's true.
cases that
Um,
were
but
settled in the hallway, I added it was much to the disadvantage of the
right.
tenants.
Yeah, your connection's breaking up a little. I can't always hear every word you're saying there, but I get the gist
Oh,
of what
okay.
you're saying. Yeah,
Is this
and
better?
that
With
might be a
respect
little
to
better,
my
but we're
connection, is this better, John?
it's a little better, yes. Um,
Okay, thank you.
in any case, what I was getting at is, and your point is very good, that many of these cases are to the disadvantage of tenants. They don't necessarily get relief. They don't always get repairs. They don't always get the harassment stuff. They just have to pay the back rent, and they might have like a time period in which they can pay the rent, and the court kind of writes this up in a stipulation, and then they go away because the judges want nothing more than to get these cases off of their desk.
John,
They
I
want
have
to.
a question. I have a question. I know there are, as you have stated, a number of uncertainties when a tenant goes to housing court. The court rules and procedures are changed, and it's very confusing, even for the lawyers themselves. Because most tenants appear in landlord-tenant housing court without an attorney, and I am not sure if to what extent the right to counsel that is organized by zip codes. I'm not sure how much that program is up and running. But the long shot that I'm asking here of my comment is, can you, given these factors, these uncertainties, can you sort of describe what a tenant might encounter if in fact they receive a non-payment petition? How does it work with respect to the social distancing, the court system?
Well,
If you
nobody
could
knows.
give us a rundown of some degree of expectation that tenants might have.
Nellie, I can't really tell you because nobody knows.
Right.
Some of the schools are not
What
yet
has
open.
happened so
There have been
far in
efforts in
housing
Brooklyn.
court?
There have been efforts in Brooklyn to move some of the civil cases to a different building, but some of the lawyers are even upset over that. And I think those buildings will not entirely reopen. The problem is you have a lot of people in a small confined space, and social distancing, as much as it's recommended and suggested and pressured on, people just don't do it. If you've been to a supermarket recently, especially the smaller ones, people are just not 6 feet apart. And then if you do try to say to somebody, stand back or something like that, somebody might object, for one reason or another. And, it's almost a no-win situation. The only thing I've been able to do is go to a supermarket at 7 o'clock in the morning where there's fewer people. And a lot of people, as you know, are just simply not wearing the mask. And that's to the extent that the masks are actually effective. Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. I actually did contract the virus back in April. Luckily, I'm pretty much recovered. But they also have this thing called the long haulers situation where people are still dealing with the symptoms, even if the actual virus is gone, you still have the symptoms. And I think I have some of that where my chest gets tight and so forth. But this is something that we're going to be dealing with for years. People are still going to be suffering the after effects of this virus. So in terms of the social distancing, to get back into court, it's a situation where there really isn't a solvable solution other than to limit the number of people going into a courthouse at a given time. You may end up with lines that are, half a mile long, people waiting to get in. And, that may be what we'll end up dealing with because the court will be under pressure to get these cases heard.
Exactly.
People, if landlords want their money, they're going to file a case. They're going to haul the tenants into court. They're going to pay good money for attorneys. And now you were mentioning the right to counsel. This was a law that was passed by New York City Council back in 2017. It eventually will cover everybody. I think there's an income restriction on it, but it eventually covers everybody. But they were phasing it in over a 5-year period. So theoretically, the entire city should be covered by 2022. But every time I check their website, every time I talk to somebody, it seems that they're lagging in terms of this actual coverage. I actually myself,
Exactly.
I was in court myself about a year ago, and this is like the seventh case that the landlord has brought against me. And the first six, I was able to get them all tossed out of court because the landlord's lawyer wasn't being too smart. But this one I felt was different. It was complicated, and so I really wanted to get an attorney. And like a lot of people, I don't have the money to go out and hire a lawyer. They're expensive. They're very expensive. So I turned not to the right to counsel because my zip code is not covered, but I'm not sure why they decided to help me. I went to a group called Mobilization for Justice, which has been around for many, many decades. They used to be called Mobilization for Youth, or MFY. Now they're
That's
MFJ.
Mobilization for Justice, in case
Right.
folks are listening. Okay.
And so I was lucky. I was able to get an attorney to help me on the case, and we ended up basically winning. Although the judge kind of left the door open for the landlord to refile the case, but we got the case knocked out. And so it was very helpful. It may be because I'm an old guy, maybe because I weigh too much. I don't know why they were helping me, but they did. But even if the right to counsel program is not covering someone's zip code, they should try to get covered. They should call a lot of these organizations. There's legal aid, there's legal services, depending on your neighborhood. Housing conservation coordinators, which is on the west side of Manhattan. Down on the Lower East Side, there's Goals, which is good old Lower East Side. These groups are all over town. They're related to the legal services and legal aid, but they're separate groups. And a person, if you're being served with legal papers, call these groups and see, and especially if a person is a senior, they should let people know that they really need the help, and see if there's some way, and these groups, just so you know, they operate on a restricted budget. So, they will have only so many lawyers that they can assign, so many cases that they can sign out. And the sooner you call, the sooner you can get some kind of answer. On the other side of the coin, for example, and I think we talked about this several months ago, there was a building next door to me, a supportive housing building, and the tenants were experiencing trouble from their landlord because he wanted to force them out so he could build an addition to the building, which was not really needed. He wanted to put in an expensive restaurant. And I said, this is ridiculous, and let's go out and get some help. I took the tenant who I've known for 20 years. We went downtown. We visited Mobilization for Justice. With two or three other groups. We went up to the Goddard Center on the Upper West Side. They were of no help at all. A guy by the name of Larry Wood, who you may have heard of over the years. He just said, no way. I found out later that the guy who runs the tenant group in that building was sabotaging the effort to try to get lawyers for these tenants. If they had gone out on their own, they might have been able to get somebody. Now, luckily, the pandemic, I say this ironically, luckily, because of the pandemic, the landlord's plans have been shelved for the time being. So none of them are actually facing a court case at the moment, but we didn't know that at that point.
Exactly.
But again, the point is that tenants, if you're being hit with, a non-payment papers or a holdover, if they're claiming you're doing something wrong. Now, to be honest, I don't know how public housing works.
Yeah,
That's a
but
whole different animal.
our time is running sort of short here, and I have a couple of questions that
we didn't even get to talk about the Upper West Side.
Yeah, I know, but excuse me, before we go ahead, I have a couple of issues I want to talk about before we move on to the Upper West Side and what's happening there with the homeless population, the park, and stuff like that.
Right.
The bottom line that we're dealing with, people have lost their jobs. Hardest hit are Black working class people, the elderly.
Right.
They don't have income. The city, as well as, just let me formulate this, and then we can have this discussion. both the city and state are facing critical deficits in their budgets.
That's true.
At least that is their position. We also know that I believe it's the Fifth Amendment, the taking clause, is that you cannot seize private property for the public good without just compensation.
Yeah,
So
that's
if
generally the
both
case.
the city, just let me formulate this. So if both the
You're tuned
city,
in to GHCR.NYC, Grant Houses Community Radio.
if both the city and the state have these crippling budget deficit and the political agenda appears to be, let's keep extending the moratorium because we don't have to face D-Day, if you will, which is where is the money coming from? Because clearly these folks don't have the money. Governor Cuomo has said, well, we'll deal with that situation when we come to it. And I believe more or less the mayor's position is somewhat similar. So let's talk through this in terms of, and also just let me throw in this. We have currently a homeless population here in this in New York City of 60,000 on any given night, and about a third of that population are in fact children. And this does not even account for the homeless population, many people who continue to sleep on the streets, subways, whatever, but not in the shelter system. So what do you think we're looking at when these moratoriums, non-eviction moratoriums run out, and that the sheriff nor the marshals can come to your house, can in fact arrive at the home of a tenant and evict that tenant? That is on a hold. But once all of this is over, what kind of bleak situation are we looking at? And is there anything that tenants can prepare themselves with, including mobilizing their political muscle through their politicians? I know it's rather long and a bit convoluted, but I think you see what I'm driving at here.
Well, I do see what you're driving at. You're kind of asking is what can be done once the human race is gone, because everything is human nature, and that means if people are going to buy into promises made by politicians who are saying that they're going to deal with this and that, and people clap their hands and they say that's wonderful, and more often
They
than not,
never do.
politicians, they never do. And I've been waiting 35, 40 years for somebody to come along to do something, and you never see it. And that's not to say there aren't some well-meaning politicians out there. There are few, but there are some. Most of the ones we see are con people. They have, it's called a constituency of one. They represent themselves. They're after to be reelected as long as they can. And once term limits come into play, they want to move up to the next level. We're seeing that. Next year is the election season for New York City municipal government. The mayor and the council, and we're seeing all sorts of people being out to run for office. They're promising everything. I mean, for example, up in the area where you live in, I think it's Council District 7. You've got this guy, Marty Cummings, running for office, and he's brand new to the neighborhood. He just moved up there a year ago. Uh, he his he his job basically is a drag queen, um, and he also belongs to what's known as the Quinn machine, the Christine Quinn political machine, because he used to live down in my neighborhood. That's how I know about the guy. But and he also he's kind of been, I don't know if hired is the right word, but he kind of represents noisy nightclubs, as if that's something that we really need to have. And that's his entire political being, and he wants people to elect him to city council. Now, I don't know who the other people are that may be running for that seat, and I don't know if the grant houses there are within that district or not. But you see this all over town. You see Ms. Dickens up in Central Harlem. She represents land. She is a landlord, and that's her entire being. Corey Johnson, he used to work in real estate. He's my
And speaking
council
of
member, and he wants to run.
right, and speaking of Assemblywoman Inez Dickens, who represents the 7th Assembly District, she was dubbed by one of the major newspapers here, media outlets, a millionaire landlord. She is a landlord. She has moved from the city council to the New York State legislature, and her opponent for the first time in a long time is Craig Slay. He is a college
Mhm.
graduate. He teaches at BMCC. The Dinkins machine were instrumental in knocking him off the ballot the first round. I mean, under very
Right.
uh, questionable
Well,
circumstances. He
let's get
just
back
let
to the
me finish
question
the
you were
thought here,
raising.
because most of this our listenership is in Central Harlem. He is now on the ballot as an independent Democrat for the November election. So I think if people want to change,
Yeah.
they might want to consider that. But the thing is that we know that the answer does not lie in the collective political body that some have described in Black neighborhoods as the Black misleadership class. But the point is, folks have nowhere to go. The homeless shelters are
Well,
bursting.
that's what I was trying to get back to, Nellie. Is that the real issue is what's going to happen with these tenants
Exactly.
once it comes time to pay the piper, and that means once they lift the moratoriums and once they lift all the other restrictions,
Yes.
and tenants get hauled into court, and there's a lot of pressure to get the cases resolved. What's going to happen? How many people are going to be evicted, and how does that impact um, other things throughout the city if people are being evicted left and right? Is there going to be vacancies? Does that roll up against the 5% limit on rent stabilization? That's a whole nother show and discussion. But that's something that we have to be on the lookout for, because people are talking about that already. If there's more than a 5% vacancy, rent regulation might go out the window. Then you have people, the homeless right now, as you said, 60,000 on any given night. Well, what happens when it's 80,000 or 100,000?
Mm-hmm.
The city is under a legal obligation
To
to
house
house
the homeless.
people, and where are they going to go? And right now, and this gets into this whole thing that we had talked about briefly yesterday, what's going on the Upper West Side is that many of the homeless, well, not many, but some of the homeless have been put in hotels. The hotels, which are empty, by the way, because the tourists are gone. So the city is paying them on average $180 a night per room per person to house these people who were in other shelters before in other parts of town, but these other shelters are just like one big room, and the beds or cots or whatever they are maybe 3 feet apart. They needed to be isolated where they wouldn't be contracting the virus from other people. It's a health emergency. So they put people in these hotel rooms. And it's not just the Upper West Side. but it's also down in Hell's Kitchen in Chelsea and other parts of the city where there's empty hotels. The number I've heard bandied about is that 139 hotels are being used to house the homeless population.
How
And
many again? Would you repeat that, please?
139 hotels. Now I've also heard 60, and I don't know where that number came from, but it's a lot, and because you have a lot of homeless people, and as you said, 1/3 of them are children, and by the way, 40% of the homeless people actually have full-time jobs, or at least they did. You know, whether they still have them or not, but these are not people who are just off being you know people who sit around all day doing nothing. Many of these people have income producing jobs. They just, for whatever reason, they're down on their luck. They haven't been able to pay the rent for one reason or another, and they end up being homeless. And there's a lot of reasons for it. It's a complicated issue, but that does not make someone who's homeless. It does not make them. So it's not criminal. It doesn't make them fraudulent. But people in some of these wealthier communities, these people, and some of them mental as well. Some around and that doesn't look pretty. You're not seeing that, but that doesn't mean that they're criminal. They're not, but people see it as that. And there's a lot of racism that's going on in some of these neighborhoods. And the same thing's happening in my neighborhood as well, down in Hell's Kitchen. There's a group that has formed, and they're trying to do anything possible to get rid of the homeless. They don't see the difference between shelter homeless and street homeless, and there is a difference. There's also gang activity, which at various parts of town, you know, they're the ones that are selling drugs or using needles or whatever. And people saying, "Well, I don't want my
What do you
5-year-old
see
child, you know,
what do
to be
you see
exposed to
as
this."
the difference between the sheltered homeless
You're breaking
and
up.
the
I
street
can't
homeless?
hear you, Nellie. You're breaking up. I couldn't hear
What do
you.
you see is the difference between the sheltered homeless and the street homeless, which is what you just said?
Okay. The street homeless are people who, for whatever reason, decided they would not trust going into a shelter. That's number one. They wanted to maintain their independence. They set up camps on sidewalks. And I don't know how they do it, but they're out there in the middle of winter, in the middle of summer, but they do it. But the thing about the people in shelters is they do have access to services provided by the city. Now, we can say the services are not well managed, they're not enough of them, but they do have services, and that means they have access to food, they have access to, in some cases, they have job training, any number of different things. But it's very much like supportive housing, which is a different type of housing. Were formerly homeless, but there's services run by service providers, and there's a number of service providers throughout the city that are under contract to the city, and they provide services to these people. So they're not just stuck in a room 24 hours a day. You know, they may have job training. They may have the ability for some level of recreation. They're not just hanging out on the street. The street homeless are a little bit different. They're the ones that are out there that are, begging for money and getting mad at people if they're not giving them money, and they may be doing other things as well. There's also there are some people, and I don't know if there's a homeless or not, but there is an uptick in drug usage. Now, where that's coming from, I don't know. But the problem is that people point the fingers at the easiest group that they can find, and that's the homeless. And
I think just a note on that. There has been an uptake on just alcohol. That's why the liquor stores were not ordered closed down. Certainly with drugs. That goes beyond the vicious behavior beyond the homeless population.
Right.
That that
Now,
is,
I mean, for example, the group down here, they're the one that is gotten all these. Uh, there's young millennials, or what we used to call yuppie scum. You know, the phrase "die yuppie scum," from back from the 80s and 90s. But a lot of them now are millennials who have moved into the city from the suburbs, and they have a sense of entitlement, and they say they have a right to sit on the sidewalk and have their mimosas, you know, during brunch on a Sunday morning, and not be, you know, have to look at some of the ugly homeless people. So when there was a restaurant and a bar on 42nd Street over closer to the river, and this group was out there making a big stink. And by the way, this is all an effort that's being funded by Corey Johnson, who wants to run for mayor. He creates a problem. So
well, just tell our listeners who
uh,
Corey Johnson is. They may not be aware of the fact that he is
well,
Speaker
Corey
of the City
Johnson is the
Council.
Speaker of the City Council. Right. He's also my council member. He's not well liked, but he's running for mayor because he's term limited at the end of next year. But what he helped create this group, and what they do is they are trying to help these people who are running restaurants. And right now, as you know, restaurants are not allowed to serve meals inside their buildings. They're all out on the sidewalks now. And if the people have to look at the homeless, so there was a homeless a hotel which was being used to house the homeless. This is next door to a restaurant, and they didn't like the fact that the homeless were entering the front door of the hotel. They wanted to force the homeless to use the back door on 41st Street, a different street altogether, so they wouldn't have to look at these people, you know, and remind themselves that there's something going on in this city that's not so pretty. And so, and they were actually to some extent successful in getting that done. They pressured the city, and I don't know if it's Department of Homeless or Bill de Blasio. I don't know who agreed to it, but they said we're going to move these people out of this hotel. So we're seeing
I
more
have
and
a
more
couple,
of that.
right. I have a couple of more
It's
questions.
yeah.
One, because,
It's just to finish my thought. It's what
uh-huh,
we used to call the pour door, where
mhm,
developers would build a building and they would put another door on the back of the building.
yes.
Basically segregation, where people, you know, who were in the affordable apartments had to go through the poor entrance, and then the people who are well off go in the front door. So anyways, go on with questions. I'm sorry.
Okay, yeah, I have a couple of more questions here. I think I'll try to get all three of them on the table. Thousands and thousands of New Yorkers have fled the city. I think I would be correct in characterizing those fleeing as white, upper middle class, rich, and they have not returned. So, with respect to the pandemic, has it slowed down the pace of gentrification? I think that's pretty obvious. And number two, with these change in neighborhoods because of gentrification, can you imagine, or do you see a reversal of those trends because of the pandemic and the fact that it is not known how long this pandemic will last? That's number one. And then number two, we need to talk about the commercial businesses that have floundered. Some of them have been shuttered permanently. But if we could just deal with those two, and starting with the, is it possible to deduce that we now see a very slow pace of gentrification? And is it possible we will see the reversal of that somewhat, because landlords, not only up here in Harlem, but throughout the city, are renegotiating leases where they have taken off $500, $1,000, whatever. If you
Okay,
could deal with
no,
that first
I
question
get what you're
first.
asking. I get what you're asking. First off, I have to challenge the premise. and it wasn't just you, but it's every day there's articles in the New York Post about how everybody is fleeing. And they even had a big interview with Curtis Sliwa a couple days ago, because he's running for
Mhm.
mayor himself. And Curtis Sliwa, for those who don't know, runs the Guardian Angels, which has been around for almost 40 years now. And but he's kind of a right wing Trump supporter, Republican, that kind of guy. And so the whole notion of thousands and thousands of people fleeing the city, I think, is incorrect. And people have challenged that. There are some people who have definitely moved out. This happened during 9/11, if you remember. The city
Mhm.
kind of turned around and people came back, or more people came in.
Well,
And I don't think it's that many that are actually leaving. Now, there were some people that, they if they're well off enough that they could afford like a cottage out in the Hamptons or upstate somewhere, they might have gone in for the
or
summer.
if they have a summer house
Or
or another house someplace, a great many New Yorkers,
well,
professional New
that's what I just
Yorkers
said.
have
Yeah,
a rental property or home ownership
right. That's what.
further upstate and in New England.
So there were
That's a
people. There were
fact.
people. There were people who left early, rather than waiting for June or July. They may have left in March or April, and they may still be out there. I don't know, but I don't think it's thousands and thousands and thousands. An increased number, maybe. There was an article again in the Post about how you can't get a U-Haul truck because they're all rented. And there may be something to that. I don't know, but I don't see the city emptying out to a great degree. Down where I am, I've not seen any U-Haul or moving trucks. I don't know anybody that's moving. There's still going to be millions of people in this town, even if a couple thousand do leave. So it's
Well,
important to challenge that.
well,
Now,
John,
the second thing on that is that
no,
if
no, no,
if
no,
there's
John, let's
well,
go.
but
Let's
let me
not
finish
leave the
because I wanted
first. Let's not leave the first, because I wanted to add an addendum to that
well, I
and to
wasn't
get
leaving the
your
first.
reaction. And to get your reaction. Black communities have been disproportionately hit hardest by the virus. There is speculation among some Black analysis that people are fleeing those neighborhoods, not in the thousands, because I can easily see that that's an exaggeration, but certainly in the hundreds, that they are fleeing because they fear, they have the fear of a contagion or contamination because of the low income, predominantly Black community that are still Black residents that continue to live
Now,
in
I could
those
barely hear a word you're
communities.
saying.
And
I can barely hear a word you're saying now. Your connection, or the connection, it might be on my end as well, but it's just not coming through very well. You're breaking up.
oh, okay. I am going to seek out another location and to see if this will clear up the breaking up. Is
Well,
this
now
is
that sounds better. Yes.
oh, okay, fine. Now, there exists some analysis that the slow pace of gentrification, which makes sense because you can't even, landlords can't even rent out their rental properties, and they're reducing the monthly rates and stuff like that. But there are a few, who speculate that because the virus has disproportionately impacted communities, predominantly communities of color, there exists a fear of contagions, contamination from that working class community. You have a lot of bus drivers and service workers and essential workers that, I might add, have been hit hardest
What's the
with
question?
fatalities
What's your question?
than other groups. So my question is, what does this pandemic and its overall impact have on the issue of gentrification in neighborhoods such as Harlem? That is my question.
Okay. Well, that okay. That was what you were kind of asking before. Um, but in terms of how it's going to impact gentrification, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. You can
I didn't
speculate,
ask you to
and you can
explain
say
it.
because
I was
what?
merely asking for your observation and what one might
Well,
conclude, might
there's
come up
Nellie,
with a logical conclusion.
yeah, you're breaking up again. So you're breaking up again there. But in any case, there's no question that the pandemic has hit lower income communities greater than people who make more money. And I'm not exactly sure why that is. Maybe it's because people who have some degree of wealth can afford to stay inside, and people who are lower income have to be out there. You know, as you cited bus drivers as an example. They have to work to make a living, bring home food and to pay the rent and whatnot. You know, they've got to do that. So there's the likelihood of them being hit higher or in greater numbers is something that it's not a welcome result, but it's something that's kind of understandable, or I should say explainable, and all of that. Now, how that impacts their ability, if they're moving out of their apartments or whatever, will that have an impact on gentrification? That I don't know. If you could draw a line, a causal line, cause and effect between empty apartments. Now, there is something which I was trying to get to earlier. If there's this is written in law. If there's greater than 5% vacant apartments in this city, then by law, rent regulations as a whole are lifted. Now, that's not happened in the last 70 years, but there has been fear and discussion that if the vacancy rate gets to a point where it's greater than 5%, then rent regulations might just go away. And that's for everybody throughout the entire state. So that's the way the law is written. Now, what they are, that 5% figure, by the way, has to be determined in a study performed every 3 years by a combination of the Census Department and HPD. There's a book, it's called the Housing Vacancy Survey, and it was supposed to be done later this year. They're trying to put it off for another year, another 2 years, something like that. So far, they haven't said they're going to raise it, but you also mentioned what's known as the takings clause, and this was the one provision in the rent stabilization law that prevented landlords from exercising the takings clause, which is part of the U.S. Constitution, which says, you know, that if you're going to invoke a rent regulatory system, you know, they either have to be made whole by some degree of compensation, or it can be done on a regulatory basis. Simply, if you can show that you're dealing with a temporary emergency, and we've had this temporary
You're tuned
emergency
in
for
to
70 years.
dhcr.nyc, Grant Houses Community Radio, home of the Community News Service and the soul of the Upper West Side.
Okay.
Go ahead, Sean.
Yeah. So I was saying, over the last 70 years, there's been the state of emergency. So we don't know if anybody's going to make an attempt. Now the problem is, in today's world, with Trump putting in new conservative right-wing judges on the Supreme Court, but also on the lower courts as well. There was a case in the last year that basically said landlords can stop. They can go around the normal process of having to go through the lower court to the medium court to the higher court. You can kind of skip a step. And I've written about it, but I don't know. Right now I can't recall the exact nature of the case, but it says that they can fast track these appeals up to the Supreme Court of the United States, and with all the right wing judges that Trump has put in place in the district courts and in the circuit appeals courts, and of course the Supreme Court, you know, the fact that rent regulation may be in danger is something that we all have to be very concerned about, because that's something that's citywide and actually beyond the city. It impacts various counties and maybe even more. You know, the more cities that opt into it now with new laws. So
Well,
that's
let
the
me just pause here for a moment, John, just to let our listeners know that this is Behind the News, hosted and produced by Nellie Hester Bailey and HCR, GHCR, and we have as our guest tenant activist, writer, author, John Fisher. Okay, John, we are really winding down here on the time. Let's talk about small businesses. When the city announced the rezoning of 125th Street, 71 small Black businesses shuttered.
Right.
They couldn't stay open. That number has almost doubled, if not triple, in these trying times, because certainly with the bailout money from the federal government, very few, if any, small Black businesses in Harlem, elsewhere in the city, elsewhere in the country, received any money to any relief funding to keep their businesses open. There seems to be a unanimous view that the city as we know it now has changed, and perhaps in a sense permanently, because a number of businesses, both small and large, will not return, particularly bars and restaurants. And
let me try to address this. I get what
that's
you're saying.
the soul and life of the city. So go ahead, John, please.
Okay, there's 2 points I want to make in answering that. First off, in terms of small business, as many of us know, the major, if not the sole, not the sole, but the major expense that any small business has is real estate expense. It's their rent.
Exactly.
That they pay. And that's true whether it's a hardware store, whether it's a restaurant or bar or whatever. It's the rent that they pay. And because of the demographic changes supported by our city council members that we've talked about, they bring in these towers, which are in many cases 80% market rent, 20% affordable. And I always say it's fake affordable because it's really not. As I pointed out in an email I put out a couple of days ago, in some places in the city, you can be making up to $225,000 per year and still be eligible for affordable subsidies. And that's just criminal. But the rent is the major expense on any small business. You know, the cost of goods sold, the cost of goods sold, marketing expense, utilities, labor, all these things factor into operating a small business. If you've ever had to do payroll, and I have, you have to balance all these things. And the problem is that the landlords are charging just too much money. That is why over the last 30 years, many of these small businesses have gone out. Now, gentrification is certainly part of the issue in all of this, but there was a solution that had been proposed, and I don't know if it would solve everything, but it was considered by many people to be something that would certainly have an effect. And it caused the real estate industry to get nervous because they wouldn't be getting as much money as they're getting now. And that's a bill called the Small Business Job Survival Act, which has been around for many years. And the politicians have been banding together, taking the money from the real estate industry and doing everything they can to kill this bill. Now, technically, it's still alive, but in reality, I think the bill's dead. And a lot of that has to do with Corey Johnson. Remember that when he's running for mayor? He's the guy that killed small business. And not the only one, but he's one of the major ones, because he would never allow this bill to come up for a vote in the city council. And there was a hearing 2 years ago, and that's what everybody said, allow this bill to come up for a vote. Now, there's other bills out there. Mostly it's pandering by various city council members. And again, it's Band-Aids. It doesn't really solve the problem. It doesn't solve the problem of the major expense of a small business being the real estate cost. Now, that's number one. The second thing is there's an imbalance in terms of small business. Now in terms of every neighborhood is different. Okay, Harlem's not the same thing as Hell's Kitchen. It's not the same thing as the Lower East Side or
Yeah,
Bushwick
obviously.
or
Yes, yes.
yeah, they're all different. They have different mixes of small business. But as a general category, small business makes up most of the businesses in any particular neighborhood because they're all on every avenue and side street, mostly in
Yeah.
small spaces that may be 70 to 25 feet wide and maybe 80 feet deep.
Yes.
And they
And
try to fit themselves
And I
into
think it's
those small
important to
spaces.
add that
But the
they
thing is, right
also
now,
employ people.
let me just finish. There's an imbalance, and my experience has been down here in Hell's Kitchen, which is next to the theater district. We have a tourist, and that feeds into the high number of restaurants and bars, in many cases noisy bars or nightclubs, which is that in itself is a problem. But back in 2000, just 20 years ago, there was around 13,000 restaurants in the city. Okay, that includes restaurants that were not serving alcohol as well. That's just anybody that serves food, and that's a number I got off the New York City government website. That was 20 years ago, 13,000. Now the number is 27,000. So there's been a doubling. Now a lot of that you could make an argument that that's tied with the increase of tourism throughout the city, and it's not just Broadway; it's all over the city. There's tourism. In some areas of town, you cannot walk on the sidewalk in the middle of the day because it's just too filled with tourists. You can tell they're a tourist if they're walking half the speed that New Yorkers are walking. If they don't talk very fast. And so that's been something that's happened over the last 20 years. There's been a doubling in case of restaurants, and many of these restaurants are not serving the local population. The cost of a dinner may be $50. I can't afford that. I'm lucky if I can afford $10 or $15 if I'm going out to eat. And so these are places that are coming in and displacing many of the small businesses that may have been in your neighborhood, say 20 years ago. I'm talking the hardware stores, the barber shops, the laundromats, you name it, come up with a long list of different types. But every community, to be a thriving community, has to have a good mix of the differing types of small businesses. And we've lost that. Down where I live, it's like one restaurant after another. And with this pandemic, people say we got to save the small business. And as a general proposition, I agree with that. But I also think there needs to be a thinning out of certain types of businesses. We don't need
John,
27,000.
I'm sorry, but we're going to have to start winding things down. Our time has come to an end. And what I wanted you to, perhaps we only have a couple of minutes left to go out with, is advice to tenants facing a rental payment crisis. Should they watch out or check out the Right to Counsel? It's done by zip codes. What is it that we can leave this program, or tenants rather, with armed with information as to how they can move forward if they find themselves in a position of facing eviction? So let's see if you can deal with that, and then a couple of minutes we are going to have to sign off. Go ahead, please.
Okay. Well, if you're in a situation where you haven't been able to pay rent and the landlord is after you, now the first thing is to negotiate with the landlord. Some landlords will negotiate for a temporary period of lower rent. But if not, then if you get papers, court papers, the thing to do is to seek out legal help and talk about that. You go to these different organizations privately and try to get help, or at least advice on what to do. That's number one. Second of all is, I understand times are very hard at the moment. Is to try to the best possible ability is to, not get in the situation where you owe that much rent. Pay partial rent if the landlord's willing to accept that. That may not solve the liability that you may have later on, but it may hold off on a court case. And that's something you do not want to do, is get in the middle of a court case. It can be very disruptive. If you're under a lot of pressure, you may be making bad decisions if you don't have a lawyer. So stay out of court if you at all can do that. And so, to the extent, I understand people have lost their jobs, but do whatever you can to try to keep some level of income. And I know that's more difficult with people that have families to support, because you got to have food on the table as well. And the important thing is to stay safe. Don't get the virus if you can avoid it. And that means wearing your mask, it means over the nose, and it's very uncomfortable. I understand that, but you got to stay safe. Stay inside to the extent that you can. I don't go out except for food, and it's not nice. I would love to go outside and do all sorts of things, but for 6 months, I've been inside, except when you have to go out. So those are the things I would say, just in general. Just be careful and be safe.
Oh, okay. And for the right to counsel, I believe if one was to Google in the right to counsel, all of the pertinent information will come up with respect to contact. What is it that you can do? Is that a correct assumption?
Well, I'm Googling it right now as we're speaking. And I just typed in right to counsel, and for some reason it's not popping up. There is a website, and for whatever reason it's not coming up. I don't know why. Oh, because I'm searching through YouTube. I'm not searching through Google. Let me try Google here. Okay, here it is. It's called righttocounselnyc.org.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, John Fisher. That does it for Behind the News. And we have this very interesting, and hopefully for you, our listener, informative program about the housing crisis that we are facing here in New York City and in Harlem, New York State, and all over the country. So if you feel that you are in trouble, or you have received a notice from the court, or a 3-day demand for rent from your landlord, get access to a computer, do a Google search. You can go to your public library and you Google in right to counsel nyc.org. I believe that's it. But even if you type in a right to counsel, that does it for Behind the News right here, Grant Houses Community Radio. Many thanks to our engineer, Doug Frazier. We'll be back here next week with another interesting program. Thank you so much for listening. Bye. Peace and solidarity. Doug? Doug?
Hello?
Yeah, Doug?
Yeah, Nellie. Hello, Nellie. Did you call me?